21 African countries are on the brink of debt distress, with governments battling the multiple economic demands in fulfilling national priorities. Well, we had a discussion on what needs to change to salvage the situation.
Quite a historical moment for Africa to be represented at the G20 seat, represented by the African Union. And it's really a move from just being rule takers to being part of the rulemaking in terms of the economic system. This, along with the fact that we've had a continuum of global South, heading the presidency of the G20 from Indonesia, India, now Brazil, and then next year with South Africa, it presents a huge momentum to actually implement some of the very necessary reforms for the global financial architecture to be more just and inclusive. And I think among these priorities, I would say, especially for this year, would be the issue of increasing availability of affordable finance at scale, and strengthening global safety nets, as well as reforming the G20 common framework. And in terms of the increasing availability of affordable finance, that would require bigger role for multilateral development banks, having bigger and better banks to be able to provide more affordable finance than countries having to tap international capital markets, to have more resources for concessional financing, whether it's at the IMF, World Bank, or multilateral development banks, to allow better use of resources, especially unutilized resources, through enabling the rechanneling of IMF SDRs to MDBs.
Quite substantial insights that you're sharing there, and I can already see David and Babadije, as well as Dauda, just raring to chip in. I'd like to bring in Dauda on my next question around some of the reforms that need to happen when it comes to reforming the global financial architecture, just borrowing off from what Hannah just brought up on the table.
Well, thank you very much, Aby. I think one of the priority of the global financial architecture reform is to help countries that are really struggling with the burden of debt to be able to restore policy space so that they can actually help their population improve their living condition, develop infrastructure and others. What I mean is, if you look at Africa right now, there is IMF and the World Bank that estimate that about 21 countries in Africa are either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. What it means is those countries are forced to allocate most of their scarce resources to service their debt instead of investing in health, investing in education, or upgrading their infrastructure. So I think any reform of the global financial architecture has to really leave those countries better off so that they can reduce the resources that they are allocating to debt service to reallocate it to other priority spending that I just talked about. So that's a key issue that needs to be done. But I think if you look at right now, the world, we see that not only Africa, but the world around is sort of confronted with a number of shocks, key of which is climate and other shocks that actually requires to improve the delivery of global public goods. So what it means is we need to find the ways to allocate more funding for climate, more funding for development. And I think key among those actors that can help us do that is the Multilateral Development Bank. That's why Hanan was talking about the importance of reforming the MDBs, like the World Bank, like the African Development Bank, like others that would be able to unlock more funding for those needs that I just talked about. It is estimated that Africa needs to spend about $1.3 trillion every year by 2030 to be able to meet its sustainable development needs. Multilateral Development Bank will be very much critical in helping that, but that means that we need to be ambitious in reforming them, and we need to be very speedy in reforming them. And I think that would be very much helpful.
And Dauda, you bring up some very weighty figures there that are mind-boggling when I hear those figures. And David, just picking off from what Dauda did bring up, from where you see it, what are some of the mechanisms that need to get kick-started to be able to help countries to transition to this very important new fiscal space that will usher in a new dawn?
Well, first of all, I think it's a very positive step that the African Union now has a permanent seat at the G20. And my organization, the One Campaign, pushed for that to happen. But now comes the hard work of the necessary reforms that will create a level playing field for the continent. And I think there are three mechanisms. Both Hanan and Dauda have talked about reducing the cost of capital so that investment in green infrastructure becomes commercially viable. There is a misconception that African countries have too much debt. They actually have a lot less debt than G7 countries when you look at it as a percentage of GDP. The problem is that their debt is too expensive. At the One Campaign, we calculated that African countries are paying interest rates of 500% more on commercial loans than what they could achieve from borrowing from the World Bank. So they could get cheaper loans from the World Bank, but currently the World Bank is too small, it's too slow, there are too many conditions. So that reform needs to happen. The second thing is we need rules and standards around climate finance. There currently is no internationally agreed definition of what climate finance is. And as a result, G20 countries just report whatever they want to report. And last year, my organization published a report called the Climate Finance Files, which followed months of investigation into what countries were actually spending on climate. And we revealed that 2/3 of reported climate finance, so 66%, was either never delivered or had nothing to do with funding issues related to climate change. So we need to get that definition right. And this year, 2024, is a really important year to do that. Finally, we must not forget concessional finance for low-income countries. This year sees the replenishment of the World Bank's IDA fund, its low-income country fund, which is one of the most impactful and flexible development funds that there is. And African finance ministers have called for that to be tripled in size by 2030. But for that tripling to happen, we need G20 countries to invest much more. They need a political signal, both from their own citizens, but also from African leaders, that this is a priority. And I think as African leaders go to the G20 summit, and as finance ministers and foreign ministers kind of prepare in the lead up to that, we need a really strong signal that IDA needs to be fully funded, and that it needs to ensure that the impact is delivering for the poorest countries that are suffering, as Dauda said, from debt distress, from the impacts of climate change, and also lots of other exogenous shocks, like the fallout from the pandemic, like the impact on energy prices that resulted from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A lot of these challenges weren't created in Africa, but they are being felt the strongest in Africa, and we need this kind of investment to help countries have the fiscal space to respond.
Thanks so much, David. And coming to Babadije, of course, as an institution, you're already doing quite a lot when it comes to bridging the financing gap. And what more legroom are you seeing, especially in this new drive towards a totally overhauled global financial architecture? And where do you see opportunity and the low-hanging fruits for institutions like yourselves to play a more proactive role?
Thank you very much for inviting us to this very, very important conversation. As you are quite aware, on the sidelines of the last African Union Summit, February, the African heads of state launched the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, also known as the Africa Club, which includes, of course, the core African multilateral financial institutions that have been set up by African countries to support the financing for development of the continent. So, as you can imagine, in a broad discussion about the global financial architecture, Africa's place, Africa's role, what can be done to increase financing, affordable, right, and scaled up financing to the continent. The Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, made up of institutions such as Afreximbank, Africa Financial Finance Corporation, and others really have a role to play, as well as a strong view on these things. First of all, we think it is way past time that the African Union was admitted to the G20. The discussions have been going on literally for decades. These are discussions that have impacted Africa, but Africa has never really had a seat at the table. And as the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, we fully welcome the AU's admission, and we expect, of course, that the AU will advocate on the behalf of the continent fully. I think the key items have been highlighted. What we need is increased, cheaper financing at scale. We may look at all the different factors, but that is what it comes to. And as such, we strongly feel that all the engagement, all the issues, as highlighted by both David, Dauda, and Hanan, which will lead to that environment where Africa will have increased access to financing. These are the key priorities that the African Union really should leverage from its discussions in the G20. And then, of course, very, very importantly, it is critical to strengthen the African multilateral financial institutions. You may be aware, heads of states, including the presidents of Ghana, Kenya, Zambia, made a very bold call recently that African states should channel, about 30% of their reserves into African multilateral financial institutions, so that these financial resources, right, can be really used to push and really drive the continent's investment into its own growth and development.
And Babadije, you are literally speaking to my next question, where how can the multilateral institutions like yourselves work closely with the AU when it comes to supporting the Africa Club to be able to realize some of the key agenda items that they have?
At the same assembly of the heads of states, the members of the Africa Club, including Afreximbank, AFC, and a number of others, were formally designated as African Union knowledge partners for the G20. So what this means in effect is that on technical issues, on policy issues, we are working very closely with the African Union in ensuring that we do the necessary technical preparations, the necessary research, the necessary evidence and data, which the African Union can advance in the very technical, right, as well as political discussions that go on in the G20. And I think as the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, we have committed to the African Union and heads of states our full support, whether materially, whether technically, to ensure that really Africa has, through the African Union, an effective representation and engagement at the G20 in a manner that will really generate the kind of outcomes we all want to see on the continent.